guys. I am Miriam Ortiz. I am currently an education consultant, and I also serve as the executive director for the Division for Learning Disabilities of the Council for Exceptional Children. I have a broad background, and I'm really honored to be here to be able to talk to you today about high impact evidence-based literacy practices for English learners. So I want to start out by talking a little bit about research-based versus evidence-based, because we see the terms used interchangeably quite a bit. So something that's research-based is supported by educational theory. So not theories like, make believe theories, but like the theory of gravity, or so we're talking about reading theory, right? So things that we have studied and we know to be true. So research-based practices are supported by education theories. They also might incorporate some evidence-based strategy. So let's say if a curriculum might say it's research-based, so it probably has components in it that are evidence-based, but maybe the whole thing has not undergone an efficacy study. So that kind of is what sets that research-based apart from evidence-based. So something that is evidence-based is something that has undergone an efficacy study, a study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal, typically high quality. So when something is evidence-based, the things that we are really looking for are, we want to have seen that strategy or that program have been compared to another type of instruction, or something like what we call our control, right? We're comparing it to something else. We also want to see that that program or that strategy has improved the students' reading abilities, and that we got those results through valid and reliable instruments or measures. We also want to see a really detailed description of how that program was implemented, or how the strategy was done, so that it can be replicated. And then we also want to see effect sizes reported in those research studies. So there's a lot more that we can talk about, but I just kind of wanted to hit on that a little bit so that we can really think about and be intentional when we're thinking and saying something is research-based versus evidence-based, so we can make sure we're using that right lens. So let's talk big picture first. So I want to start by talking about the science of reading, right? We've been hearing those terms, we hear that a lot, but what exactly is the science of reading? And how is it relevant to what we're talking about today, right? So the science of reading and evidence-based strategies, right? They go hand in hand, right? So the science of reading, big picture, is this large body of research, right? So that's been going on for many, many years. And it tells us some specific things. It tells us how children learn to read. How do we do assessments, and what assessments should we use, and how to interpret those assessments. It also tells us why some children have difficulties in reading, and how to intervene, and what are best practices for intervening. And then it also tells us how to use all these different components of literacy, right? So phonemic awareness, phonics, comprehension, vocabulary, writing, spelling, and then even just instructional practices like differentiation, to really promote reading proficiency in our students. So taking it, like zooming in a little bit more now. So thinking about literacy instruction with our students who are English learners, it's something that it's a little bit more complex. It gives us a little bit more to think about, because we see differences not only in that the languages, right? So English versus whatever the language, the native language is, but maybe the student's own native language development. They may have differences there. Their English language proficiency, which is what I just said. Also, what are these students' previous academic experiences and their background experience? Their cultural backgrounds also play a significant role in how they learn, how they approach school. And so those are all things that we need to take into consideration. So I want to get you guys involved a little bit. So let's take about 30 seconds. And so you guys are all here for a reason, right? You want to learn a little bit more about how to work with our English learners. So type in the chat for me, what are some of those challenges that you're experiencing in your setting? Or do you have a specific question or something that you're really wanting to know or discuss today? So I'll give you guys 30 seconds. Go ahead and let me know, what is there any particular challenge or anything specific you're interested in learning about or you want to know today? Oh, we've got some great questions, things in the chat. Great. Okay, awesome. So this is great because we're going to talk about several of these things today. Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, great. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. That was really helpful. Okay, so we're going to hit on all of these topics today. So we're going to start by talking about oral language. We're going to talk about phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and then explicit instruction, and then assessment as well. So we're going to hit on assessment. So let's start out by talking about oral language. That's a really big one. And so we're going to talk, hold on, sorry, got to move the chat here. So we're going to talk about why is oral language important and what do we know? What does the research say about oral language and oral language development for our English learners? And what can we do? So oral language is complex, right? It relates the sounds we hear to meaning, and it really is our basis of language and literacy. We've got two types of language. We've got expressive language, which is our speaking. And then we've got expressive language which is our speaking, and then we've got receptive language, which is listening, and listening our ability to understand what we're hearing, right? What we're listening to. And both of those do directly impact our vocabulary development. So let's break it down even further. So there are 5 components of our oral language, and we're going to break them into categories. So first is going to be form, right? So let's talk about phonology, which is those sound systems that's used by the speaker. Morphology, that study of the smallest meaningful parts of words. Syntax, so the rules of how we're going to organize those words into sentences. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Then semantics, so what do these words mean? And when you organize those words, right, in different ways, they mean different things sometimes. And then pragmatics, how and why a speaker communicates. So what does the research say? What does it say about oral language? And what do we need to know as educators? So we know that the more children know about language, right, they're going to be better equipped. They're going to have the tools to succeed because they're going to have more words, right, in their vocabulary. That's going to allow them to recognize more words when they read them, help them decode them more easily. It's going to help with comprehension. So exactly what number 2 says. It's going to help them understand that written text. And it actually has been identified as one of the strongest and earliest predictors of success in literacy. And so we see strong relationships between listening comprehension and reading comprehension. So let's talk a little bit about some myths and facts that we know about language development. So we typically hear, and it's actually a myth, that learning two languages at the same time can cause language delays in children. So I remember hearing that when I was younger. So I'm sure many of you have heard this myth before. But actually, we know that learning two languages does not cause confusion or language delay. In fact, research tells us that multilingual students show increased cognitive function. So what we really want to do is encourage multilingual families to speak to their child in the language really that they feel most comfortable. Because what we want to do is we want to build that language, build that vocabulary, build that background knowledge, right? So what are some of these evidence-based practices that we can do and we can use in the classroom? So the first thing we want to do is model good language ourselves. So what does that look like? That looks like talking to your students. Really, it's as simple as talking about what you're thinking, talking about what you're doing, modeling that good language when you're responding to their questions. Another great strategy that we can use is extending what the students say to us. So for example, if we ask a question like, what is your favorite sport? And the student responds with a one-word answer, we want to expand that. We want to extend it. Oh, basketball is your favorite sport. So we're modeling that good language so that they can hear it. We also want to use academic language accurately often so our students can hear that. We want to model that language. We want to be consistent with that language. One way we can do that is a word of the day, right? Maybe an SAT word of the day. And then instead of using talkative, maybe you can say, you guys are being very verbose today, and use that the entire day and have the students use that in context and practice using that vocabulary and make it fun. We want to model, right? We want to model good language rather than enforcing it. So we can do that by when the student makes a mistake, instead of telling them, no, that's not how you say it, that's wrong, you say it like this. You can just model it, repeat what they said, but say it correctly so you can model it for them. So we also want to make sure that we're not just asking the child to say something. Instead, we can teach them through that modeling, right? So for example, if we ask the student, what did you eat for breakfast this morning? I had coffee and toast for breakfast today. So just a simple model showing how to respond to that question. Like I said earlier, we want to also explain things as we're doing them. So that's as simple as, okay, now I'm going to write on the board the objective for today. I'm going to write it because I want you guys to understand what it is we're going to be focusing on. So it really is just a lot of communicating and talking. And as simple as it sounds, it builds that vocabulary, it builds that language. This also goes for when you're teaching a new concept. This is really critical in math. I saw someone in the chat asking about transferring these strategies to math. So it's really important. You want to think aloud. Why are you solving the problem this way? What are you going to do next? Why did you decide to multiply and not divide? So really just speaking it, modeling it, thinking aloud. You also want to read to your students, read aloud to them. And this is something that honestly, at any grade level, the students find fun and engaging, right? You want to provide those opportunities for your students to hear rich language. And if they can't access the text by reading it themselves, then reading it to them shows them prosody, good fluent reading. It improves their listening skills. And it also facilitates other things in the classroom, right? So it empowers their imagination. It builds empathy. It builds a love of reading, and also may even facilitate important conversations. So reading aloud, you're never too old to have someone read aloud to you. So definitely a strategy that you want to use. Another strategy that, even though you can see it was originally researched and most often used in preschool, but it's actually becoming a more popular strategy to be used in the upper grade levels as well. So what dialogic reading is, it's really what it sounds like, right? You're building a dialogue while you're reading. And there's a lot of research actually that supports dialogic reading in building language. So you're having a conversation, you're reading a story and having a conversation about the story while you're reading it. So how do we do that? So an adult reads a book to the student. So you're going to read maybe a page or two, and then you stop periodically to engage the students in a conversation. You're going to encourage them to maybe interpret pictures or the text. Maybe you're going to ask them how they feel about certain things. And you also want to have a hierarchy of questions, right? A hierarchy of prompts. So some that are more simple, some that may be more complex. So there's a little bit more about this in this book by Rolanda O'Connor. This is an excellent book. If you don't have it, I do highly recommend it. And it gives specific strategies that you can implement for teaching word recognition. And it talks about all kinds of things, but it talks more about the dialogic reading on those specific pages. So I'm going to keep moving because I know I have a lot of things to talk about and we don't have a lot of time, but please feel free, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. So moving on with vocabulary and oral language, we also want to make sure that when we are reading, when we are talking to our students, we're thinking about culturally unique vocabulary and we're cognizant of that, right? So what does it mean to toss a pizza, right? That's something that terminology is something we use here. Or the word cool, or this, what is a faucet? Or, oh, you're feeling antsy today? You know, what exactly do these specific phrases mean? So being careful about saying these phrases in the classroom and also limiting that use of figurative language, right? So that, because our students so often take our language, even our younger students who are not English learners, you know, take our language very, very literally. So really thinking about our figurative language use when we use it, so limiting that use, and then if we are going to use it, explaining what we mean. So I'm sure if you have heard of another one, these are some common ones that we might hear, right? So the coffee shop is an ice box. Really, what exactly does that mean? So thinking about our figurative language. So one example I can give you is my little boy, well, they're older now. My boys are 8 and 10, but when they were about 3 or 4, I remember telling my husband a story about something that I heard that was very funny. And I told my husband, "Oh, I almost died." And I remember my son looking at me and his eyes getting really big, like, "Oh my goodness, you almost died." So really thinking about, how our students can take that language and making sure that we're explaining it and not using it too often in our classrooms without explanations. So here's another one that we want to try to do, and here's how we can incorporate that, right? So we want to try to allow scaffolding with the native language when possible. So this might look like pairing a student with someone who speaks their native language, but then we also need to make sure that we're balancing this, right? So thinking about when we do that, that we're not using or putting like undue pressure on that other student that we're pairing the new student with, right? We want to make sure that we are balancing that, we're thinking strategically about that. But it's helpful, for example, for explanations, right? We want to allow those specific explanations to be given in that native language. It helps to build that comprehension. Um, we also have found that allowing our English learners to pre-write and brainstorm when they're writing in their native language actually leads to higher quality writing. So thinking about when to strategically use that scaffolding with the native language. It also builds a sense of confidence for our students, and that's something that is really powerful. When we build our students' confidence and their motivation, they are going to be more likely to take academic risks. They're going to feel more comfortable doing that. So when we can facilitate that, it becomes a really powerful tool that we can use in our classrooms. So I'm going to go ahead and move to our next topic, which is going to be phonemic awareness. So what is phonemic awareness and what does the research say about it? So phonemic awareness is being able to hear and manipulate those smallest units of sounds in spoken words, right? So a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in a spoken word. So phonemic awareness is being able to hear that and being able to manipulate those sounds. So our students, especially our English learners, they need to be able to hear and reproduce those sounds in English before they can really make those associations with letters. Now, we do have a lot of research that supports teaching phonemic awareness. And we want to also explicitly teach our students how to blend those sounds together when they are given those sounds orally. I'll give you a model in a second. And how to segment those sounds. So be able to hear those individual sounds in words. And for our typically developing students, many of our students, it takes as little as, and I know this sounds like a lot, but actually it's really not that much, 6 to 10 hours of total instruction for them to acquire those blending and segmenting skills. And we want to do those not in sitting down for hour sessions, but in these brief 10 to 20-minute sessions. So how can we build that? So we want to give students a lot of experiences with hearing these sound patterns and reproducing them. And so the way we can do that is with songs, with chants, and read alouds. We also want to be cognizant of sounds that are not necessarily present in the student's native language. And we want to be cognizant of that as well, not just when we are teaching those phonemes, right? But also when we're assessing our students. If that particular sound is not in their vocabulary, right? If it's not in their language, they're not necessarily going to be able to hear it when we are giving them an assessment that has that sound in it. So for example, in Spanish, right? So that ng sound and the th sound, we don't see that in Spanish. So we want to practice hearing those sounds and reproducing those sounds, and practice by helping our students understand like how to shape their mouths to say those sounds, especially the sounds they're unfamiliar with, right? So you maybe can do this by using a mirror, by just having them look at the shape of your mouth when you are putting them in different positions, so to pronounce those phonemes. Also, if the students are literate in their native language, then you can focus on those differences between their native language and English. You also want to help and make sure that they practice and they know those sounds in English. They can hear the sounds and reproduce those sounds in English before you move on to connecting it to those letters. Now, there are some students that may struggle. So especially our students with significant needs, we see a lot that they do struggle hearing and isolating those sounds. So in those instances, yes, definitely we want to use letters. We want to go ahead and link it to letters. So I'm not saying not to do that, but we want to have them hear those sounds. We want them reproducing those sounds. We want to make sure they're fluent in that. Then we want to bring in those letters. We also want to explicitly teach how to blend and segment phonemes, right? So here's just a very simple model of how to do that. So for blending, we can just do this anywhere. You can do this in line. You can do this while you're waiting. When everybody's lining up at the playground, there's lots of different things because you can do it orally. So you say the sounds as the teacher. Listen to the sounds in this word and tell me the word. At, and then you want the students to say that. Or you can practice segmenting. So listen, mat. Say the sounds in mat. And then you want the students to segment those sounds and identify those individual sounds. We can also use, right, our Elkonin boxes to help students visualize those sounds when they're segmenting those words. So they can either touch the boxes or move an object into the boxes as they say the sound. So for example, if we're doing the word mat, we would say at. And so as they say each sound, the little token goes into the box. Any questions so far? Right. Okay.
I have one, Miriam. Are there resources, and you may not know this off the top of your head, are there resources you could recommend that might support practitioners with some of what you were talking about, like the sounds that aren't present in maybe multiple languages that we would need to be aware of?
There's not one place that I know that aggregates all of them, if that's what you're asking. So I'm not familiar with any place that really, is like a one-stop shop for you to go and find that. I would recommend, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but thinking about where your students come from, what is their native language, and then doing specific, research and taking some time to do that, because you not only want to take into consideration like those phonemes that are different, but also how is that syntax different? How is their sentence
Mhm.
structure different? Because I'll give an example in Spanish and in French in just a minute. So really thinking about how, oh, great question. So someone's asking, is it best to start with blending and segmenting with our EL students and leave out rhyming and syllable segmentation? So I would say we want to start with um we want to start with, if it depends on the skill level of our student. It also depends on if they're literate in their native language, right? So if they are literate in their native language, then I would say yes, go into that phoneme by phoneme, blending and segmenting, helping them identify those individual phonemes in the words. If they aren't, then you really want to break it down even further and do first sound. Um, Rhyming is helpful, but we also don't want to I'm not saying don't do rhyming, but don't get stuck with just doing rhyming. I think that's a support that you add in as well. Um, let me see, let me make sure. You guys are awesome putting in resources and things in the chat. Love that. Also, we in Spanish, when we're learning to read, right, we learn teaching syllables, right? But we also want to take into consideration the skill level of our students. And for our students who are struggling, right, students with learning disabilities or who may have more significant needs, then it is actually really critical to go phoneme by phoneme. All right, so I'm going to keep going so that we don't run out of time. So let's go ahead and start talking about phonics. So phonics, right, is that next step. So we have our phonemic awareness. Now we're moving to phonics, where we're matching those sounds to either individual letters or groups of letters, right? And the reason why we teach phonics, right, so that the students can learn to blend those sounds and help them decode words, right? It's the next step. We really want to make sure that we're providing that direct instruction in phonics, because again, of those differences and those that we know exist in the different phonemes. And so also we know that English, right, is a very interesting language. So there are some sounds in English that, or some letters that combine to make sounds in English that don't do that in other languages. So making sure that we're using that direct instruction to teach those things explicitly is really important. We want to make sure that we're teaching letter sounds and we are really being intentional about how to pronounce those sounds correctly, and we model that as teachers. So thinking about we typically want to start with the most common sound for those individual letters, right? And so this is something that is a skill that we would really like mastered in early kindergarten. So, and again, for our students with more significant needs, again, we want to really focus on those letter sounds, even though, yes, knowing letter names, it's definitely a skill those students need to learn. But for our students that really have more significant needs, we want to definitely focus on those sounds more than the name. I've included here, and there will be a handout that will be shared, but this is a link to Dr. Holly Lane and an example of how she pronounces each of the letter sounds, and it's on the University of Florida Literacy Institute page. And so here's also a cheat sheet that you can use. This is by Dr. Jill Lohr and Dr. Mindenkup. It's a resource that you can use for thinking about how to say letter sounds appropriately, right? So we want to say for A, it's going to be the A sound. That's going to be the most common sound. So A as in apple. And then for our stop sound, so for example, the B for boy, we want to make sure that we are not adding that schwa sound to the end of that. So we want to make sure that we're not saying B for the letter B. We want to say B. We want to keep it very brief, and we don't want to add that behind it. Because then when we're teaching that blending, it gets really confusing. Let's say, for example, dog, right? You want dog, not dog, because that doesn't, go together to make a real word.
Miriam, I have a question. One of my last few years in the classroom, I was working with a kindergarten student learning her letter sounds, and she was learning English. She was a Spanish speaking student, and my visuals on my sound deck that I was using, like a typical OG deck, but with visuals, would throw her off. So she would see, for example, grapheme D with a dog, and she would say, "Pup." But I learned very quickly, like, why does she keep saying like the
Yes,
Spanish word for dog is perro. So is there something, is that something to consider, like visual, like reconsidering your visuals you use?
definitely.
Or
I think that's something that you also want to fade that out when you can, right? So it is helpful. It is a good scaffold if the student needs it, but not all students need that visual, right? And so that modeling, that explicit practice, and that immediate feedback that we'll talk about in a little bit is going to be really what's key. So thinking about, sometimes you may need to remove that extra visual, right? To provide that appropriate instruction. So that is a really great point that you brought up. And really remembering that when we're thinking and we're teaching the common letter sounds in English, the vowel sounds in Spanish are very different than the vowel sounds in English. So that's another consideration that we really want to think about and be intentional about. So we want to make sure, so taking the next step, right, from teaching our individual letter sounds, then also want to teach sound spelling patterns, right? So we know that teaching sound spelling patterns helps our students to decode. And reading and spelling words with those common patterns are supportive. They support one another. So explicitly teaching those different letter patterns is going to help our students be able to decode those words. So a really simple way to do that, again, that explicit teaching, right? So write that pattern on the board. So for example, in this case, it's going to be that ch. So these letters go together and make the sound ch. Say it with me. So what is that sound? Ch. Now let's read these words. And then you practice previously taught words with other patterns, and you add in the new pattern. So really just very simple, very brief, direct instruction, explicitly teaching those patterns. We also want to take that time to teach morphology, right? So we talked about that at the very beginning. So morphology is the study of those meaningful units of our language, and so how we use them, right? So for example, if we have the word car, adding the morpheme S changes that word, right? It holds meaning. The word car holds meaning, and the S holds meaning because it tells us that there is more than one car. So it changes the meaning of the word. So really thinking about teaching that explicitly is going to be really important. We also want to think about how we teach sight words and what we call sight words, right? So a lot of times we actually call irregular words sight words. But what we're really thinking about, right, are words that are not necessarily spelled according to those common patterns. We know what decodable words are. Now, we have temporarily irregular words that are words that are spelled with those phonics patterns that have not been taught yet. And then we have what we call, what a sight word is, would be words that the student recognizes instantly when they see them. And then our high frequency words are our words that appear often in print. So really thinking about those different types of words and how we communicate that to our students using clear and consistent language and accurate language. And then making sure that we're not asking our students to code irregular words, because believe me, it happens so much more often than you think. We also want to develop knowledge. So this is going back to what we kind of mentioned before with thinking about the phonemes that are different in the different languages, but also we want to think about what are the similarities and differences in the syntax, right? In the linguistic patterns. So for example, in English, we would say, the pretty girl, talking about the little girl in the picture, right? So we have the adjective before the noun. But in Spanish, we would say la niña bonita, right? So we have the noun and then we describe our noun after, not before. And then thinking about the way you would say it again. So in French or Creole, so the adjective comes after the noun. So similar to Spanish. So when our students are speaking or writing, we might see these differences. So being cognizant of those differences and explicitly teaching that how it is in the English language to our students. So just some considerations before we move on to fluency, because I see my time is running short. So I'm going to try to do this quickly. Just remember, thinking about how the language, the phonemes are, and the way the language is built. So for example, does it use a non-Roman alphabet or non-alphabetic? So for example, my boys are actually learning Mandarin in school. And so in Mandarin, they actually use symbols, right, to represent words, and the different symbols together make new words. So it's very different than what we would see in English or in Spanish. So thinking about that and thinking about how that's different than what we're used to. Also, again, just a reminder to point out those different letter combinations that have same sounds, and we want to provide extra targeted practice with that. And we want to really focus on those vowel sounds and comparing and differentiating that. So in Spanish, for example, the A makes a different sound. It makes more of a short O sound, like that's what it would sound like in English. So for example, gato, we would say that for the letter O in English. So really thinking about those vowels, because that's where you're going to see a lot of challenges and difficulty. So really explicitly teaching those differences in the sounds, practicing the shape of the mouth when you're saying those different sounds. And then when you're practicing words during phonics instruction, trying to use words that are meaningful and appropriate according to the child's oral language. So for example, the word suds is decodable, but I can tell you that, at least in my house, we don't use the word suds a lot, right? So it wouldn't be in my boys' oral language vocabulary necessarily. So when they're reading that, they're not going to be familiar with that. And then remembering to be patient, right? So our English learners are going to need that additional time. They're going to need targeted practice, and preferably in small groups. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So let's talk quickly about fluency. And so fluency is that ability, right, to read text with accuracy, with automaticity, and prosody. And then the reason why we want fluent reading is to support and enable comprehension. It's that bridge, right, between word recognition and comprehension. What we need to remember is that that speed, that rate is actually less important than the accuracy and the ease of reading when we're thinking about fluency. And so we want to remember that even though, yes, we have a lot of assessments that look at oral reading fluency, but we want to remember to really emphasize that accuracy and ease of reading. Because a lot of times when our students are being timed, then they believe that speed is the goal, right? But we want to make sure that we're measuring what they're reading accurately and with reasonable expression. And so sometimes we actually need to slow the kids down in order to accomplish that. So some strategies we want to use to build that fluency is we want to make sure we're using that phonics instruction in connected text. So we want to target those areas where our students have needs and then practice that in connected text. It's also okay to have our students read simultaneously with some technology assistance, right? So maybe an ebook or an MP3 so that they can listen and keep up and with that reading and that rate and the expression. We also want to remember that when we're having the students do repeated readings, that it's with a text that they are familiar with. If they're using a text that has unfamiliar vocabulary, it is not going to increase their fluency. It is not going to be beneficial for them. We want to practice that fluency with texts that are in the independent level or in their instructional level. This is another reason why, sustained silent reading isn't very helpful, right? Because if they're already struggling, if they're not getting that feedback from the teacher, they're not really building their fluency or really gaining anything out of that sustained reading. So we also want to be really intentional, right? So when we are thinking about selecting text for our students, we want to think about the scope and sequence that we've been teaching. What skills are our students familiar with and what do they still need to practice with? We want to monitor that difficulty of the text, and we want to think about the different characteristics that we want in the text that they're reading. So what's the decodability of that text? Does it repeat high frequency words? Is it meaningful? Is it interesting? Does it present them with a lot of unfamiliar vocabulary? It's also important to use culturally authentic texts when possible. We don't want to just get books that are translated from one language to another, because a lot of times there's a disconnect there. That literal translation doesn't really work out. So thinking about texts that are culturally authentic by authors that are from the same cultural backgrounds as those in the story. And then not forgetting our comprehension strategies, right? So thinking about how there have been a number of times that I've worked with English learners that are really great decoders, right? They're really fast and they're really accurate, but they're not necessarily comprehending the meaning of what they're reading. So being intentional about teaching comprehension strategies, self-monitoring for those comprehension strategies. So making sure that we're pairing that fluency instruction with good instruction in comprehension. All right, so let's summarize. Let's finalize by talking about the importance of explicit instruction in all of this. So a lot of the strategies that I've been talking about today include at least some form of explicit instruction. So let's break that down. What exactly is explicit instruction? So that's when we're overtly teaching each step through modeling and examples. And what we see often is that framework of I do it, we do it, then you do it. We want to break those lessons into some sequential, manageable steps for our students, and we want it to progress from something that's simple to more complex. So what does I do it look like? So that looks like modeling what you're thinking about, giving an example of the finished product or of the objective, like explicitly showing the students, this is what I want you to say, this is what I want you to do. Teaching vocabulary explicitly and using visual aids. So that might be pictures or that might be physical items. Let's say you're reading a story about different types of coats. If it's feasible, bring in those different types of coats. Model that for the students. Build on their background knowledge. So have them share in their culture what is typical in that situation. Or for example, if you're reading a story about grandmothers, have the different students share what do they call their grandmother. That is culturally responsive, and it helps build that background knowledge, makes those connections. Also, it's super important in really being clear and consistent in your language. So our English learners really need lots and lots and lots of repetitions to learn that new skill. So we want to make sure that when we're making those repetitions, when we're repeating things, we're keeping it the same every time and using clear, accurate language. One example that I love to use often is, showing the students these numbers and asking them, well, which one is the bigger number, right? That is not clear, accurate language. This is so confusing, right? So making sure that we are really being consistent and clear. Then we move from the I do it to the we do it. So we want to make sure that we have facilitated that time for some supported practice, working through the process together. And this could be, in the content areas, this could be in relation to that explicit phonics instruction. And here's another place where using that native language as a scaffold is really helpful. But we want to make sure that we're also providing immediate corrective feedback, because we don't want our students to be practicing something, right, continuously incorrect. For example, my son is learning how to play baseball and he really wants to learn how to pitch. So he is practicing, right, the proper techniques for pitching. And it's excruciating sometimes for him because, we're constantly like, oh, you've got to change this a little bit, you've got to do that, but we're giving him that corrective feedback immediately, because once he practices doing it incorrectly, that's going to become the norm, right? He's going to be doing it consistently. But thinking about how we provide that feedback is also really important, right? We want to do it in a positive manner. So for example, let's say the student makes an error in reading a word that's an irregular word. So what we want to do is just model that word for them. So for example, if the word is want, then we want to just say, that word is want. Say it with me. Your turn. And then if it's a decodable word, then what we want to model is how to decode the word. Watch me sound out this word. Mad. Sound it out with me, and doing it together, and then having them do it themselves. Notice how in neither of these examples, did we say, hey, that was wrong, do it again, or no. You just model that corrective feedback. And then the you do it portion is giving the students that opportunity for them to respond and demonstrate what they've learned. And this doesn't always have to be in a worksheet or a physical product that they're turning in. It could be having all the students have whiteboards and raising them up, or maybe green cards and red cards for different responses, giving them opportunities to turn and talk and having them fill out a KWL chart or a graphic organizer. And then we want to also think about how we use our small group instruction and our whole group instruction. We want to leverage that and we want to use it very powerfully. We want to teach our big skills and giving opportunities to hear from one another during whole groups. But then we really want to use small groups to target those specific skills and specific deficits. And the reason why small groups are so powerful is because it gives our students more opportunities to practice, more opportunities to respond. And it gives them that teacher time with some specific feedback and gives the students a safe space for them. And then that brings us to our last point, which is really thinking about how we use our assessment to drive instruction. So really thinking about using those curriculum-based measures that are aligned with what's being taught. Thinking about identifying those areas of needs, and then also thinking about using our screeners, right? Our screening assessments and our progress monitoring regularly. And that's a whole nother presentation I could talk about and give, and we're not going to do that today. But things that we can think about and we should consider when we're using assessments with our English learners, just really reviewing those assessments, having them think aloud on some of these assessments, identifying potential challenges in advance, thinking about what accommodations we could use. And then I can't stress this one enough, using multiple forms of assessment. I had a student once who was an excellent reader. And when she went from kindergarten to first grade, even though she was a fluent reader reading on like second grade level, because she wasn't able to do a nonsense word fluency assessment, they put her in an intervention group because they only use nonsense word fluency to identify need. So they didn't use multiple forms of assessment, and this little girl was in an intervention group that she really didn't need to be in. She was a fluent reader. So really making sure that we're using multiple forms of assessment, doing our due diligence for our students. So here are some great resources that I highly recommend using and looking into. And then, like I said, the center will post these slides so you'll have access to them. And then also the What Works Clearinghouse, and they actually do have a practice guide for teaching and working with English learners. So I know it's 6:59, Larissa. I'm sorry, I'm right there, but
Oh, you're
I'm
fine.
happy to stay and take some questions.
Yeah. Do you mind going back 2 slides, I think, real fast?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, give me a second.
That one's cute too.
This one?
I think so. Was this the one that someone needed?
I'm sorry, the next one after, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. One after that one.
Okay.
With the practice guide. Those are always fabulous. It's always nice when you get on there and you find one for what you need it for.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? Thank you. I really connected with a lot of the things that you said and just found like, all of the practical strategies for those individual areas of literacy, but really seeing how to integrate them as well across.
I have a really quick question for you. In our district, the majority of our population is ELs, and Spanish is the only, so it's Spanish and English. And so we are in dual language campuses. And so one of the things that happened ever since we made the shift from balanced literacy to a structured literacy based teaching, one of the things that we noticed right away with the foundational skills was that one, we were not aligning, and two, what was happening was that it was, so what we have developed has been like, we're doing 2 foundational blocks per day. And so we're requiring teachers to do 1 in English and 1 in Spanish. And although we have seen great results, one of the things that we are concerned about is having to teach things, you know, like some of those foundational skills that do transfer, like kind of trying to find the balance. What would you recommend with that? Because it's just like, we don't want to, I feel like we're working extra hard, but we also don't know how else to support our students, and that they don't miss out on explicit systematic phonics instruction every day in the 2 languages. So
Wow, that's amazing, first of all, that you guys are doing that. So kudos to you. Well, there's so many thoughts that come to mind. First of all, they're really unfortunately, there aren't a lot of resources that can help, right? Like bridge that. And so that would be something that I think that's a whole direction for anybody who wants to do a dissertation on that. That would be awesome. I think this is an opportunity for you to really leverage using that assessment to drive your instruction, right? Like, I think that would be what would be key. Thinking about what are the specific needs, finding those right assessments to identify the needs of your students so that you can really target the ones that really need that level of specificity. And then for those who don't, like, you don't necessarily need to provide that because of what transfers over. So I think that would be, the most feasible, right, realistic solution currently, like really leaning into that formative assessment, those curriculum-based measures to identify what are those specific needs of those students and grouping them accordingly.
yeah. Okay. Thank you. And one of the things that we are going to include next year, because we were not doing this, is their English language proficiency assessment data. We're also going to tie that in to their universal screener data, and then just identify, like, if they're level 1, then what type of support do they need? If they're level 2, what type of support do they need? But I mean, it just seems like it's a lot of work for for the teachers, but at the same time, like, we're seeing like how much growth our students have had, like a year's growth. Like, we're actually noticing, like, we have 1 student in 1 campus who is a level 1 out of all our students in kindergarten, which we have never ever seen something like that. But at the same time, we don't want to leave those other kids that are already ready to move on, like, behind. So it's just, I guess, finding the right balance. So thank you. I appreciate your recommendations.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I wish I could give you something more specific, but I mean, that's really, it's a dance, right? Like, thinking about those multi-level tiered systems and really thinking about what that looks like and how to reasonably facilitate that with the resources that you have.
Yes,
So
and that actually just came about because in Dr. Powell Smith's class, we had to do some research on some MLSS, and my focus was ELs. And there's not a lot of research out there. And one of the things that I did learn that I had proposed, and so I'm really confident in that, is that ELP assessment data needs to be included. And so it's really exciting to know that, like, we're headed in that direction, but there's still a lot more that we need to learn. So
definitely.
thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question, Dr. Ortiz? The quick question was, you mentioned this, and I knew it, but I just was trying to find the research on it. Where unfamiliar vocabulary is not going to build fluency. And a lot of times with decodable text, it is completely unfamiliar vocabulary. About 90% of it is unfamiliar for most ELs. I'm an EL teacher, sorry. And I was just running the research you had seen on that because I know things and I've read things, but I can't put my finger on where the research came from. So if you know, I'd be very grateful.
Oh, goodness. Well, this is one of those situations where I cannot give you the exact citation, but if you give me your email or if you email me directly, I will put my email address up on the screen. I can get back to you on that. So I'm very happy to do that. Just send me an email and I will follow up on that with you.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. Oh. You're on mute, Larissa. Do you mean to be on mute?
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you for sharing some of those resources. A couple people pitched in the chat and we're helping out with authors and book titles and websites. So thank you. All right, thank you so much.
No, it is my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And yeah, if anyone has any other questions or follow-ups, please feel free to reach out to me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miriam. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, Miriam.